When Barack Obama took the stage that day, most people expected his usual blend of calm delivery, sharp wit, and carefully chosen anecdotes that connect politics to everyday life. But few could have predicted the effect one seemingly casual remark would have. At one point during his speech, Obama turned his focus to the broader idea of America as a nation built by immigrants. He reminded the audience that this country has always been shaped by people who arrived from somewhere else, searching for opportunity, stability, or a fresh start. To illustrate that idea, he chose an example that startled many in the room. With his characteristic smoothness, he mentioned Melania Trump's journey to America. He didn't linger on it, nor did he frame it negatively. In fact, his tone was complimentary, noting that her story, like so many others, was proof of the American dream's continued relevance. On the surface, it seemed like a harmless observation. Politicians often refer to high-profile figures when trying to make a point that resonates with the public. Obama's intent, at least in the eyes of many listeners, was to make the immigrant narrative feel relatable and modern. Instead of pointing to a historical figure from centuries ago, he highlighted someone currently in the national spotlight, someone connected to one of the most famous families in America. But what may have been meant as a bridge-building example quickly became a spark for controversy. The mention carried a weight that went beyond a simple anecdote. By choosing Melania's story, Obama was effectively acknowledging the contrast between Trump's hardline immigration stance and the fact that his own wife had once been an immigrant pursuing a path to citizenship. This subtle juxtaposition didn't escape the crowd. A murmur rippled through the audience, some chuckling quietly, others nodding as if the irony had just been laid bare for all to see. It was classic Obama, a single sentence, delivered almost offhandedly, yet carrying layers of meaning. For those who admired him, the reference was a clever way of humanizing the immigration debate. By tying the issue to someone as well known as Melania, Obama gave the idea a face, a story, a personal connection. Supporters saw it as an attempt to remind Americans that the topic wasn't abstract, it was woven into the very fabric of the people in power. But for those close to Trump, the reference felt like a veiled jab. They knew how fiercely protective he could be when it came to his family. Even if the words weren't openly critical, they touched on sensitive ground. Behind the calm delivery, the remark held the power to sting. Immigration had always been a cornerstone of Trump's political messaging, a subject where he drew some of his strongest lines in the sand. To have Obama point out that his wife's success story fit into the same narrative he often challenged was more than just a reminder of irony. It felt, to Trump, like a personal undercut. To the audience, it may have sounded like a thoughtful connection. To Trump, it was something else entirely. Observers later reflected on the way Obama phrased it. He didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize. He simply held up Melania's experience as an example of what America could make possible. Yet the precision of his wording left room for interpretation. Was it praise, a subtle critique, or both? That ambiguity only magnified its impact. Those who admired Obama saw it as respectful acknowledgement. Those who sympathized with Trump saw it as crossing a line. What made the moment stand out was not just what was said, but who said it. Coming from any other speaker, the reference might have passed with little notice. But Obama and Trump had a long, complicated history of rivalry, stretching back years. Every word between them was measured not just for meaning, but for intent. That gave even the most benign-seeming remark an edge sharper than it might have carried otherwise. And in this case, the mention of Melania's immigration story lingered in the air, echoing louder than expected, hinting at a tension that would only grow once the speech was over. When the speech wrapped up and the applause died down, most people in the audience moved on, treating Obama's reference to Melania as just another talking point in a long list of remarks. But for Donald Trump, the words didn't fade so easily. The mention stuck in his mind, gnawing at him long after he left the event. Witnesses who were near him backstage described how his expression shifted almost instantly. He didn't explode outwardly in front of the cameras, but the tension was visible in his jaw, the clipped way he spoke to his aides, and the restless movements of his hands as he paced. It was the kind of reaction that didn't need words to be understood. He was angry, and it wasn't the usual political sparring that set him off. It was the feeling that his wife had been pulled into the crossfire. Once out of public view, the restraint he had managed to keep on stage gave way to a torrent of frustration. Those around him said his voice rose quickly, the volume matching the sharpness of his words. He called Obama's comment totally unnecessary, and emphasized that no one had the right to use Melania's personal history to score political points. To him, it was more than a remark, it was an intrusion into his private life. He was no stranger to tough criticism, having faced years of jabs, parodies, and heated opposition. But when it came to Melania, the protective instinct in him overshadowed everything else. People in the room described the scene as unusually intense. Trump paced back and forth, repeating his anger in slightly different ways, as though replaying the moment in his head and trying to find the exact words that bothered him most. He questioned why Obama would bring her up at all. He could have used any example, he snapped, according to insiders. But he picked her. Why her? The idea that his political rival had chosen Melania's story seemed calculated to him. Even if the tone of the remark sounded calm on the surface, the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that it wasn't innocent. Asterisk for those watching, it was a side of Trump that contrasted with his usual public persona. On stage, he often thrived on confrontation, firing off responses with confidence, sometimes even humor. But behind closed doors, his anger over this particular issue was raw and unfiltered. It wasn't about policy or polls, it was personal. The moment revealed how deeply he drew a line between political sparring and family matters. When the two collided, he reacted with a level of intensity that even his closest aides sometimes struggled to manage. Asterisk. His fury wasn't just directed at Obama at one point. He turned on his staff, demanding to know why they hadn't anticipated such a remark. "You should have seen this coming," he barked. To him, part of the role of his team was to shield him from surprises. And the fact that Melania's name had come up without warning only made him more upset. It wasn't that his staff could have stopped Obama from saying it, but in that moment, he wanted answers, accountability, and reassurance that someone understood just how personal this felt. Asterisk. Those who knew him best recognized the pattern. When he felt someone had crossed into his family's territory, his anger didn't stay on the surface, it simmered. He replayed the words again and again, almost as though he was searching for proof that Obama had done it deliberately. Every time he repeated the remark, the frustration grew louder. Some aides tried to calm him, suggesting that the reference wasn't meant to be an insult, but he wasn't convinced. For Trump, intent mattered less than impact. And the impact was clear. He felt his wife's story had been used in a way he didn't approve of. Asterisk. Observers later reflected on how much the private outburst contrasted with his silence on stage. The cameras hadn't captured the anger, which made the behind-the-scenes reaction even more surprising. The public saw him walk off with his usual confidence, but those in the room afterward saw the other side. The pacing, the raised voice, the clenched fists. It was as though he had bottled up the explosion until he was away from the spotlight, and then let it all pour out at once. Asterisk. This wasn't the kind of anger that could be brushed off with a quick statement or a witty comeback. It lingered, affecting his mood for the rest of the evening. He carried it into conversations that had nothing to do with the speech, returning again and again to the same theme, that Obama had crossed a line by bringing Melania into the picture. To Trump, it wasn't just politics as usual. It was personal territory, and in his view, that was sacred ground. Asterisk. Donald Trump has built much of his public identity on being the one who controls the narrative. In rallies, interviews, and even spontaneous exchanges, he thrives on speaking first, cutting sharp, and leaving opponents scrambling to respond. That rhythm, him on the offensive, others on the defensive, has always been his comfort zone, which is why the moment Barack Obama mentioned Melania's immigration story stood out so much. For once, the balance shifted. Instead of Trump setting the tone, he became the subject of someone else's carefully placed remark. And what made it even more unusual was that he had no ready response in the moment. Asterisk. The scene played out in a way few expected. Obama, with his familiar calm delivery, dropped the reference as smoothly as he might recall a fact from a history book. The crowd chuckled lightly, some nodding in recognition of the irony. All eyes instinctively flicked toward Trump, waiting to see if he would fire back immediately. After all, that was what people had come to expect from him. A quick jab, maybe a sharp quip, something to remind everyone he wasn't one to let anything slide. But instead, he stayed silent. He didn't seize the microphone, didn't interrupt, didn't react outwardly in front of the cameras. That silence in itself was shocking. Asterisk for his supporters. The absence of an instant comeback was jarring. This was the same man who, in debates and rallies, prided himself on never letting an opponent get the last word. And yet, here was Obama, delivering a line that touched directly on Trump's family, with Trump standing there and saying nothing. Even if only for a brief moment, the reversal was complete. Trump was on the receiving end, and the audience knew it. The roles had flipped in a way no one could have scripted. Asterisk. That role reversal carried more weight than the words themselves. For years, Trump had built his reputation on being untouchable in verbal sparring. He branded opponents with nicknames, mocked critics, and spun even the harshest attacks into punchlines that worked in his favor. But this time, the dynamic was different. Obama didn't mock or insult, he simply pointed to Melania's story as an example. That calmness made it more difficult for Trump to brush off. It wasn't bombastic, it was subtle, and subtlety, when aimed at him, often had a sharper sting because it left less room for the type of counterpunch he thrived on. Asterisk. Insiders who watched him after the event said the lack of a public comeback weighed on him. In private, he replayed the moment, frustrated that he hadn't spoken up instantly. He saw Obama's mention as not just a reference but a calculated move designed to put him in that exact position. Forced into silence, left to stew later on. To Trump, that wasn't just irritating, it was humiliating. The man who prided himself on always being the loudest voice in the room had for a moment been reduced to the one holding back words. Asterisk. The irony was not lost on political observers either. For years, Trump had turned other people's vulnerabilities into sound bites that echoed through the media cycle. He could transform a single phrase into a headline by the next morning. Now, with Obama's smooth remark, he he found himself on the opposite side of that dynamic. The tables had turned, and it was his family's story, something deeply personal, that became the headline everyone was talking about. Asterisk. What stood out most was how out of character the moment felt. Trump's image has always been about control, dominance, and immediacy. Yet here was a situation where he had to absorb the hit without striking back on the spot. That dissonance made the incident linger in people's minds far longer than a typical exchange of political insults. It wasn't just about what was said, but about what wasn't. His silence in public contrasted so sharply with his fury in private that the gap itself became part of the story. Asterisk for those close to him. The reversal was more than an unusual blip, it was a reminder of the one area where he seemed most vulnerable. When it came to his wife, he wasn't the same unshakable figure he projected in political battles. He could deflect insults about his policies, his businesses, or even his own character. But bringing Melania into the picture changed the equation. It pulled him out of his comfort zone and into unfamiliar territory. And that shift, however brief, showed a different side of him, a side not used to being on defense. A side that revealed just how much the tables could turn when his family was involved. Asterisk. For Donald Trump, politics has always been about drawing sharp lines, friend versus foe, strength versus weakness, success versus failure. But when Barack Obama brought up Melania's immigration story, those lines blurred in a way that made him visibly uncomfortable. The remark may have sounded harmless to some, even flattering to others, but to Trump it represented something more delicate. The intrusion of family into the political arena. He had built his brand on being combative, on handling insults and attacks with forceful comebacks. But when the subject turned to his wife, the rules were different. That moment revealed how protective he could be, and how the personal boundaries he guarded so fiercely didn't always align with the rough-and-tumble world of politics. Asterisk. Behind closed doors, aides noticed how often he returned to the subject. He spoke of Melania not just as his wife, but as someone whose story wasn't for others to use. He made it clear that her journey was deeply personal, something that belonged to her, and, by extension, to their family, not to political opponents seeking to illustrate a point. His anger wasn't only about Obama's words. It was about what those words symbolized. To him, the mention of her immigration journey stripped away the private layer he tried to maintain around her, pulling it into a spotlight she hadn't asked for. Asterisk. Trump's reaction highlighted the tension between his public persona and his private instincts. On stage, he often seemed unshakable, eager to dominate and unwilling to show vulnerability. Yet, in this case, the very idea of Melania being spoken about without his control touched a nerve. It was a rare glimpse into how deeply he drew boundaries around his family, boundaries he believed were not to be crossed. Even though Melania had long been part of the public eye as First Lady, he still viewed certain aspects of her life, especially her immigration story, as off-limits, unless he chose to share them. Asterisk. Observers saw this as one of the few times his defensive side outweighed his offensive nature. Usually, he thrived on confrontation, but here, his concern wasn't about winning a point or outsmarting an opponent. It was about defending personal space, even if the defense came in the form of anger rather than calm explanation. His fury underscored how politics for him was never just a game of strategy. It was entangled with pride, loyalty, and a fierce instinct to shield those closest to him. Asterisk. In conversations afterward, Trump reportedly described the remark as crossing the line, repeating the phrase enough times that it became clear he saw the moment as more than a casual slight. To him, politics could be brutal, but there was an unspoken code. That family was different. When Obama touched on Melania's background, even gently, Trump interpreted it as a violation of that code. He believed political opponents could come after him directly all they wanted, but involving his wife was unacceptable. Asterisk. This reaction revealed an often overlooked side of him, the way he compartmentalized public battles versus private matters. He could shrug off criticisms about his policies or his business decisions, sometimes even spinning them into opportunities to rally his supporters. But the second the focus shifted toward Melania, his tolerance evaporated. His protectiveness showed not only in his words but in the way he carried the grievance, refusing to let it go even when the cameras moved on and the headlines shifted elsewhere. Asterisk. For many watching, it was striking because it cut against the grain of the image he projected. Trump, the man known for quick retorts and relentless counterattacks, was suddenly defined by something more personal, the instinct to draw a line around his family. It was shocking, not because he defended Melania and few would expect otherwise, but because of the intensity with which he reacted to a moment others might have brushed off. In his mind, the political arena had rules, and one of those rules was that family remained untouchable. The fact that Obama had stepped near that boundary, even with a compliment, set off an alarm that explained why his anger burned so fiercely. Asterisk. The incident showed that beneath the larger-than-life persona was a man who placed certain aspects of his private life above the political battlefield. His willingness to fight anyone, anytime, did not extend to watching his wife become part of someone else's narrative. For him, that was not a political issue, it was personal territory, and it was a territory he was determined to protect. no matter how small or subtle the remark that encroached upon it. Asterisk. In the end, the episode surrounding Barack Obama's mention of Melania, Trump's immigration story, turned into more than just a fleeting moment in a speech. It revealed layers of Donald Trump that the public rarely saw. While he has built much of his reputation on being combative, fearless, and quick to answer critics with sharp words, this time his reaction was different. It wasn't about defending a policy position or countering a political argument. It was about drawing a hard line around something deeply personal. Asterisk. For Trump, Melania's journey is not simply part of a broader narrative about immigration. To him, it represents a private chapter of their lives, one that doesn't belong in the arena of partisan bickering. That's why Obama's reference, no matter how calm or even complimentary it may have sounded, sparked such a fierce reaction. It wasn't just the words themselves, but what they symbolized. The idea that his family, and particularly his wife, had been brought into a debate without his consent. Asterisk. This moment was striking because it highlighted the difference between Trump the public figure and Trump the husband. In politics, he thrives on confrontation and rarely backs down. But when it comes to Melania, his instincts shift. He becomes protective, even defensive, in ways that catch people off guard. That protective side is not one he often displays on stage, but behind the scenes. It shapes how he interprets and responds to situations. Asterisk. Observers came away from the incident with a reminder that even the most powerful figures carry vulnerabilities. For Trump, those vulnerabilities are not about political attacks or media scrutiny. He has faced those for years. Instead, they are tied to the people closest to him. Melania in particular represents a boundary he doesn't want crossed. When that boundary is tested, his reaction is sharp, emotional, and persistent. Asterisk. It is also telling that the anger lingered long after the applause had ended and the cameras had been turned off. That persistence showed just how much the issue weighed on him. For many, the moment may have seemed minor, a single reference in a much longer speech. But for Trump, it was a spark that ignited something deeper, something tied to loyalty, pride, and the instinct to shield his family from what he considers political intrusion. Asterisk. In politics, moments like these matter not only for what they reveal about immediate tensions, but for what they say about the people involved. Obama's calm delivery and subtle choice of words once again demonstrated his ability to make points without raising his voice. Trump's fiery private response revealed just how deeply personal lines can cut, even for a man who has built a career on appearing untouchable. Asterisk. Together, the two sides of this incident painted a picture of how politics can blur the line between public battles and private lives. What seemed like a passing remark became a flashpoint, not because of its content alone, but because of how it landed with the person it referenced. And in that sense, it offered a rare glimpse into Trump's inner world, a world where family stands above politics, and where even the smallest mention can spark a storm if it crosses the boundaries he holds sacred.